Welcome to the second part in my Great War series of videos. We will start with the little known event of the Christmas ceasefire of 1914, then have an in-depth look into World War I tanks, as well as a legend around Joe Perterson and one of those tanks. Look at the life of President Woodrow Wilson of America, the construction and the politics, and the eventual sinking of the Lusitania, and much more. One of the most unbelievable things of World War I was the Christmas ceasefire of 1914. It is simply unbelievable that men would go from doing their best to kill each other to celebrating Christmas, having games of soccer, sharing cigarettes, sharing alcohol, those that could talk to each other, even sharing jokes. And it was all wasted because after they went back to fighting.
Christmas Truce, 1914. It will be over by Christmas. That was what many of the 60 million soldiers sent to fight in the First World War had been told, and like so much of what they had heard about the conflict, this was a lie. War had been declared in July 1914, and by Christmas of that year, there was no end in sight. Millions of soldiers were dug in trenches along the Western Front. The soldiers were packed together, living in freezing conditions. Often these soldiers were living a stone's throw from their enemy, with the distance between British and German trenches as close as 30 meters in places. Late on Christmas Eve, German troops began unwrapping gifts from home, with many having been sent Christmas trees with candles. As the German soldiers lit their lanterns and displayed them on the edge of their trenches, carol singing broke out. Soon enough, the British and French troops joined in. Christmas greetings and well wishes were exchanged, and offers of a temporary ceasefire were communicated between the trenches. Fear and distrust gave way to humanity. As the sun rose on Christmas morning, troops from both sides tentatively made their way out to no man's land. The troops began to greet one another, and messages and gifts were exchanged. In a number of places, caps and jackets became goalposts as spontaneous games of football broke out, at least one of which the Germans allegedly won 3-2. Corporal John Ferguson was among the many soldiers who wrote about their experiences that Christmas. What a sight, little groups of Germans and British, extending almost the length of a front. Out of the darkness we could hear laughter and see lighted matches, a German lighting a Scotchman's cigarette and vice versa, exchanging cigarettes and souvenirs. What makes the truce of 1914 so surprising is that it was not one truce but many. The British-held area of the Western Front stretched across swathes of land, and was home to a huge number of troops. Dozens of impromptu truces sprung up across the front involving over 100,000 soldiers. While there were instances of failed truces, or areas where the fighting continued, the scale of the truces that were observed is remarkable. The lull in fighting lasted until the new year in some places, but ultimately the pause was brief and the peace was short-lived. While a number of similar instances occurred throughout the war, there was never another truce on the scale of Christmas 1914. In the wake of the events of the Christmas Truce, there was a crackdown by the military higher-ups of both forces. British High Command feared that similar incidents could undermine morale and erode the antagonism between German and British troops. Steps were taken to try and ensure it would not happen again.
It's terrible to think that after the Christmas amnesty stopped, that people went back to killing one another. And the High Command of the Germans and of the Allies was not going to have this again. Anybody who tried to do such a thing in 1915 was under threat of death. In a relentless search to break the trenches, work was started on a secret project known as a tank. Its true and secret name was the Landship. The idea was far from a new one. Leonardo da Vinci, in 1487, designed a tank as shown. And you'll notice that his tank has sloping sides, and that gives a huge advantage in terms of materials used and protection given. When a piece of steel is at 90 degrees, as shown in the drawings, and my research showed that the material thickness of the tank was ½ inch or 12.7 millimeters, a bullet or other projectile has simply 12.7 millimeters to pass through. However, if you place the material at a 30-degree angle and it is struck by a projectile at 90 degrees to the surface, then you have 24.5 millimeters or almost an inch to pass through. This is an enormous design advantage and was not recognized by the World War I tank creators. It wasn't until 1932, with the development of the German Panzer tank, that this design characteristic was found again. This is yet another example of ancient knowledge and ancient wisdom being relatively recently discovered.
The concept of a vehicle to provide troops with both mobile protection and firepower was not a new one, but in the First World War, the increasing availability of the internal combustion engine armor played in the continuous track, as well as the problem of trench warfare, combined to facilitate the production of the tank. The name tank came from British attempts to ensure the secrecy of the new weapons, under the guise of water tanks. During the First World War, Britain began the serious development of the tank. Ironically, the Royal Navy led the way with the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, establishing the Land Ships Committee in early 1915. The military combined with engineers and industrialists, and by early 1916, a prototype was adopted as the design of future tanks. Britain used tanks in combat for the first time in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on 15 September 1916. Mark 1 Battle of Flers-Courcelette. The first official photograph taken of a tank going into action at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, 15 September 1916. The early tanks were slow and unreliable, shown by the fact that of the 49 tanks deployed for the battle, only 25 actually moved forward at the start of the attack. As production increased and reliability improved, they were used in greater numbers. By the summer of 1918, they were a common element of British fighting methods, with around 2,600 tanks manufactured. France began development in late 1915, eventually creating the Renault FT light tank. This was the first to use a fully rotating turret that contained the tank's main armament, the basis of tank design ever since. Over 3,000 of these machines were made by late 1918. By contrast, Germany lagged behind. German forces often salvaged British and French tanks, both for research purposes and to use on the battlefield. Germany developed the A7V tank, but only 20 were produced.
Some rare footage of some excited Germans after capturing an English tank. And in the game of cat and mouse, a German tank that had been captured by the English. The original British tank was quite well armed, coming in a number of different configurations, both male and female. Yes, that's right, tanks have sex too, and was crewed by 8 normally, and had a ridiculously slow top speed of 6 kilometers an hour, carrying 230 litres of fuel and only capable of covering a distance of 38 kilometers, with a mass between 27 and 28 tonnes depending upon whether male or female, and more than 2,000 were built. I was lucky enough when in France to lay eyes on a Renault tank. They are quite heavily armed for their size, but less well armed than their larger counterparts of both the English and German tanks, and have an unusual thing called a tank gun. I would call it a cannon, but it has a 37mm capacity, so it's quite large. And in my opinion, this tank is probably the best designed of the 3 candidates. They were crewed by 2, and it would be incredibly cozy in there because there's not a lot of space. They had an improved top speed on the English of 7 kilometers an hour, but still ridiculously slow, and a relatively small fuel capacity of 95 litres, giving them a range of 60 kilometers, which was superior to the British tank. And they are a lightweight, 6.5 tonne, and more than 3,000 were made. Germans have always been excellent engineers and good at warfare. Not even the Romans could defeat the Germanic tribe in Europe. Yes, that's right, Europe was tribal 2,000 years ago. Their tank is an amazing piece of work. It is crewed by between 18 and 25 people, and how they would fit in there I would have no idea. In terms of top speed, at 15 kilometers an hour it is twice as fast as the other two contenders, with a massive fuel capacity of 500 litres, giving it an unquestionable range of 80 kilometers, with a mass between 31.5 and 34.7 tonnes depending upon the way it was armed. And thankfully only 20 of these tanks were built. Now, I was curious to know how one could find its way to Brisbane, Australia in the Queensland Museum. And I was told a funny story, which is not true, but it shows how when a strange artifact turns up in an unusual place, the stories that revolve around it. Before Federation in 1901, Australia functioned as different states. The states themselves functioned as independent countries. Queensland was, of course, one of those states. And the first place in the world where Australian troops was deployed was not in fact Gallipoli. It was the Boer War in 1899 until 1902. And I guess one would wonder why someone would jokingly say that the longest serving Queensland Premier, Joe Perterson, would buy a used German army tank for a rugby game. Well, the simple fact was that Australians were very, very upset about apartheid and things that were happening in South Africa. And there literally had to be a state of emergency so that gentleman could host a rugby game, of all things. And that's why the suggestion that a tank would be needed would be made, even though not true. But I guess it's probably that I should let history speak for itself.
Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen died aged 94, won 6 elections as Premier of Queensland from 1968 to 1987. He also won the label from the Australian Labor Prime Minister Go Whitlam of Bible-bashing bastard. Bjelke-Petersen was the antithesis of the Sydney University-educated Whitlam, who was federal prime minister from 1972 until he was toppled in 1975. Bjelke-Petersen became leader of his then politically and economically sleepy state after the death of his predecessor. Once in power, through ruthlessness, luck and merchandising by adept minder and spin doctor Alan Callaghan, later jailed for fraud, he soon came under the national spotlight. Callaghan made a virtue of the Premier's folksiness, malapropisms, unfinished sentences, forgetfulness and unassuming ways. The Premier had an instinct for attacking progressive ideas, human rights and centrist notions in government. In 1971, when anti-apartheid demonstrators challenged the South African rugby team tour, he declared a state of emergency to allow the team to play in Brisbane. In 1972, through adept balancing of constituency boundaries, he won a second term on just 20% of the popular vote. He went on to become virtually unchallenged within the National Party, and, allied with mining companies and property developers, made Queensland an economic powerhouse. He saw his job primarily as facilitating business. He wanted to drill for oil on the Barrier Reef, and was untroubled by concepts such as conflict of interest, the separation of powers, patronage, or using state power to punish his enemies. A key moment in his clashes with Whitlam came in 1975. Defying convention, Bjelke-Petersen rejected the Labour nominee to fill a Queensland federal Senate vacancy and installed a man hostile to Whitlam, thus depriving the federal government of its Senate majority. This meant that as political crisis engulfed Australia, Whitlam was ousted from power. Bjelke-Petersen's downfall came in the late 1980s, after a television documentary exposed corruption in his government and in the state police. The report of the ensuing Fitzgerald inquiry engulfed his administration. 4 ministers and the police commissioner were jailed. The Labour Party defeated the Nationalists at the polls, and Bjelke-Petersen was charged with perjury. Bjelke-Petersen was born in Dannevirke, New Zealand, the son of a Danish Lutheran pastor. When he was 2, the family emigrated to Kingaroy, 200 kilometers from Brisbane, where they endured a hard life building up a farm, and Bjelke-Petersen contracted polio. He would say such things as "time to feed the chooks," an Australian colloquialism for hens, Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen would say before his daily media conference. His platitudinous exhortation to reporters, "Don't you worry about that," became an Australian catchphrase. Despite his devout Christianity, Bjelke-Petersen felt no compunction in adding to the biblical injunction, "Do unto others," quote the words, "as long as you get in first." In a state becoming super rich on coal exports and tourism, a donation to the National Party /funds became mandatory for any business wishing to win a government contract. Bjelke-Petersen's solipsisms found an echo in a hillbilly region which considered itself distinct from the world at large. But while his syntactically fractured speech and mixed metaphors amused the press and the country, his comments on minority groups appealed to underlying racism. He once referred to an Aborigine as Mr. Wichettigrub, and stated that Indigenous Australians were as rich as the sheiks of the Middle East. His was a rustic eccentricity, charming a gerrymandered and naive electorate. Johannes Joe Bjelke-Petersen, born January 13, 1911, died April 23, 2005.
Despite the efforts of people like Joe Bjelke-Petersen, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, Nelson Mandela was victorious in April 1994, bringing about the first black government in South Africa and simultaneously ending apartheid. When you look at the world, you can see that people like Joe Bjelke-Petersen, no lessons were learnt from the Great War. The Allies were desperate for America to join into the war. However, President Woodrow Wilson remained neutral. He was a true pacifist, but even a pacifist has to stand up to a schoolyard bully when the bully attacks them, as was the case with World War I. There were a range of historical events, the sinking of the Lusitania and a telegram to Mexico, which eventually brought him into the war. Perhaps at this point we should look at President Woodrow Wilson so we can gauge his successes, his failures, and what sort of a person he was.
Homer's Woodrow Wilson, born December 28, 1856, died February 3, 1924, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919, and was born in Staunton, Virginia, to parents of a predominantly Scottish heritage. Since his father was a Presbyterian minister and his mother the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, Woodrow was raised in a pious and academic household. He spent a year at Davidson College in North Carolina and 3 at Princeton University, where he received a baccalaureate degree in 1879. After graduating from the law school of the University of Virginia, he practiced law for a year in Atlanta, Georgia, but it was a feeble practice. He entered graduate studies at Johns Hopkins University in 1883, and 3 years later received the doctorate. In 1885 he published Congressional Government, a splendid piece of scholarship which analyzes the difficulties arising from the separation of the legislative and executive powers in the American Constitution. Before joining the faculty of Princeton University as a professor of jurisprudence and political economy, Wilson taught for 3 years at Bryn Mawr College, and for 2 years at Wesleyan College. He was enormously successful as a lecturer and productive as a scholar. As president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910, Wilson became widely known for his ideas on reforming education. In pursuit of his idealized intellectual life for democratically chosen students, he wanted to change the admission system, the pedagogical system, the social system, even the architectural layout of the campus. But Wilson was a thinker who needed to act. So he entered politics and as governor of the state of New Jersey from 1911 to 1913, distinguished himself once again as a reformer. Wilson won the presidential election of 1912 when William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt split the Republican vote. Upon taking office, he set about instituting the reforms he had outlined in his book The New Freedom, including the changing of the tariff, the revising of the banking system, the checking of monopolies and fraudulent advertising, the prohibiting of unfair business practices, and the like. But the attention of this man of peace was forced to turn to war. In the early days of World War I, Wilson was determined to maintain neutrality. He protested British as well as German acts. He offered mediation to both sides, but was rebuffed. The American electorate in 1916, reacting to the slogan "He kept us out of war," re-elected Wilson to the presidency. However, in 1917, the issue of freedom of the seas compelled a decisive change. On January the 31st, Germany announced that unrestricted submarine warfare was already started. On March the 27th, after 4 American ships had been sunk, Wilson decided to ask for a declaration of war. On April the 2nd, he made the formal request to Congress, and on April the 6th, the Congress granted it. Wilson never doubted the outcome. He mobilized a nation, its manpower, its industry, its commerce, its agriculture. He was himself the chief mover in the propaganda war. His speech to Congress on January the 8th, 1918, on the 14 points, was a decisive stroke in winning that war, for people everywhere saw in his peace aims the vision of a world in which freedom, justice, and peace could flourish. Although at the apogee of his fame when the 1919 Peace Conference assembled in Versailles, Wilson failed to carry his total conception of an ideal peace. But he did secure the adoption of the Covenant of the League of Nations, known today as the United Nations. His major failure, however, was suffered at home when the Senate declined to approve American acceptance of the League of Nations. This stunning defeat resulted from his losing control of Congress. After he had made the congressional election of 1918 virtually a vote of confidence from his failure to appoint to the American peace delegation those who could speak for the Republican Party or for the Senate, from his unwillingness to compromise, when some minor compromises might well have carried the day, from his physical incapacity in the days just prior to the vote. The cause of this physical incapacity was the strain of the massive effort he made to obtain the support of the American people for the ratification of the Covenant of the League. After a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, on September the 25th, 1919, he collapsed and a week later suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, from the effects of which he never fully recovered. An invalid, he completed the remaining 17 months of his term of office and lived in retirement for the last 3 years of his life.
The standard model is that the Lusitania was sunk, and that is what brought America into the war. That is not completely correct. Other things had to happen. The Zinnemann telegram was a big factor in America coming into the war, and we'll look at the details of that later. The Lusitania in itself is a fascinating subject. It was the biggest and fastest ship of its time, and a symbol of British pride. The British government even had a stake in the ship, with the Admiralty having the idea of using luxury liners as auxiliary battle cruisers, fitting them with a single heavy gun, and their speed would be an amazing advantage to them in the event of the outbreak of war. Even as far as 1905 they were thinking about war. It did not prove to be successful, however. It was said that after a week of testing the auxiliary liners that the Admiralty coal bunkers were empty, and that idea was soon forgotten about. So let us now explore the amazing Lusitania, its place in history, and its amazing engineering.
At the end of the 19th century, the Cunard Company was facing increasing competition from Germany's North German, Norddeutscher, Lloyd, and Hamburg America Line. German ships such as the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, Deutschland Kronprinz Wilhelm, and Kaiser Wilhelm II were leading the industry in terms of size, speed, and comfort. At the same time, American financier J.P. Morgan acquired the White Star Line for his own conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine. Morgan soon owned, or at least had a controlling interest in, all of the shipping lines on the North Atlantic except for Cunard and the French line. Morgan offered to purchase Cunard, but Cunard declined. At the same time, Cunard did not have the financial resources to respond to the competition with new ships. Even though Morgan promised that British-flagged ships would be available for the use of the British Admiralty in times of war, The British themselves were concerned that their ability to dominate the waves was at stake, and that they were either going to be outcompeted by the Germans or bought out by the Americans. In this period of crisis for British shipping, the chairman of Cunard, Lord Inverclyde, turned this crisis into an opportunity for Cunard. He approached the Arthur Balfour government for a loan and a deal. By an agreement signed in June 1903, the British government gave Cunard a loan of £2.6 million to finance 2 ships repayable over 20 years, at an interest rate of 2.75%. The ships would receive an annual operating subsidy of £75,000 each, in addition to a mail contract worth £68,000. As a quid pro quo, the ships would be built to Admiralty specifications, so that they could be used as auxiliary cruisers in times of war. These 2 ships would be the Lusitania and Mauretania.
With the funding secured, the draftsmen got themselves busy, and the ship was finally launched on July 7th, 1906, by the wife of the director of the Cunard Line, Lady Mary Cried. They had put more than 4 million rivets into the construction of the ship. The passenger configuration was changed on account of a vibration problem. I suspect very probably they couldn't balance the propellers correctly. But the initial construction had 502 cabins in first class, 460 cabins in second class, and 1,100 people could stay in third class, or what was then called steerage, with a total passenger capacity of 2,298. The refit in 1915, I believe, was partly brought on by the Titanic accident. A lot of rules and regulations changed at that point. Indeed, I believe J.P. Morgan supported the building of the 3 ships, the Olympic, Titanic, and what was then the gigantic, later to become the Britannica, as a form of payback for Cunard not selling out to him. In the refit, the passenger capacity was dropped to 2,165, but it was somewhat more comfortable. The ship had 369 engineers to run it. It was quite an effort, and the overall length finished up to be 239.8 metres, and the beam of 26.7 metres and a draft of 10.2 metres. It seems in that period of time the number of funnels was important, but in the Lusitania's case it had 4 working funnels, and indeed 2 masts, and you can see on the drawings the enormous radio towers that were on board the ship. In those days they had to use long wave rather than short wave, and it is said that you could literally hear the signal if you stood near the aerials. The ship had a service speed of 25 knots and a maximum speed of 26.35 knots, which is incredibly fast. And to get that speed, it had a hell of a hunger for coal, burning 840 tonnes per day, with a bunker capacity of 7,000 tonnes, giving the ship a maximum endurance at service speed of 8 days and 4,800 nautical miles. I know from experience that when you slow down, fuel consumption drops off massively. I cannot offer you any figures as to what the fuel consumption would be were the ship to have slowed down. And it was also designed with 16 lifeboats on board after the 1915 refit. The British government was quite crafty with some of the darker letters in the Lusitania contract regarding speed. If it's your wish to get something moving, what you need is sheer raw power. I think it's time for a bit of a demonstration. Yes, that one will do. 12 cylinders at around 600 horsepower. The car park was a little bit slippery, but as soon as we got onto the autobahn we had no trouble at all getting that power to the ground and getting the big beast moving. Since the dawn of time, there has been a relentless search from mankind for more and more power. In the early days, animals were used. Indeed, humans themselves were used to power things. During the Industrial Revolution, animals were replaced by steam. But the hunger for horsepower continued. Before us is a row of steam engines on display at the Hunter Valley Steamfest. None of them greater than 20 horsepower. You may think 20 horsepower is little, but in fact it is quite substantial, as steam horsepower is in fact bigger than brake horsepower. The Lusitania had engines of 75,000 horsepower. An incredible amount of power. But before these engines could be built, a committee was formed called the Turbine Committee, whereby piston engine performance and turbine engine performance was compared in all aspects that they could consider. They found that piston engines were more efficient at slow speeds and turbine engines were more efficient as speeds increased, which is precisely what they wanted from the Dreadnought and the Lusitania, with the Dreadnought being the leading technological warship of its time, with an unbelievable top speed of 21 knots, and first started on the 2nd of October 1905 and launched on the 10th of February 1906. However, it owes a great deal to that of the Lusitania, who was started at an earlier date of the 17th of August 1904 and eventually launched on the 7th of June 1906 with an impressive top speed of 26 knots. The development between the two ships was shared. Looking at the bow, you can even see a similarity of the shapes of both ships. One of the problems with turbine engines is that they cannot provide reverse thrust unless gearboxes are used. So in the early days, the ships were fitted with reversing engines for the purpose of providing reverse thrust. The John Brown shipyard was given the contract to build the Lusitania, and James Burns himself, in Clyde, chairman of the Kennard shipping line, put in place the first of many rivets. The Colossus slowly rose, and eventually the skeleton took on the appearance of a mighty ship. All was made ready. The people gathered. Lady Mary in Clyde, complete with a bottle of champagne, thrust the bottle towards the ship and give it its name. The mighty Colossus slew into the River Clyde, with no one in the crowd having any idea of the place in history the mighty ship would eventually come to hold. The Lusitania was a veritable floating palace. The oceans had never known a vessel so grand. Her fixtures were the best that money could buy, but no doubt after its launch, its builder, John Brown, was very nervous on account of the requirements under the contract for the vessel's speed. I will share with you the historical accounts of the events.
Trials and trouble. Lusitania's engines were tested in June 1907, where she jaunted up and down the Clyde. As Lusitania was a gigantic financial gamble for both Cunard and the British government, the full trials on 27 July were held in secret. Representatives from Cunard, John Brown, the Board of Trade, and the Admiralty would all be on board. Should Lusitania not be able to reach her contract speed of 24½ knots, John Brown would be fined £10,000 for every 1/10 of a knot under the requirement for a maximum fine of £100,000. To their delight, Lusitania reached a record-breaking 26.4 knots. On 1 August, she attained 26.7 knots, far exceeding her contract speed. To their horror, her high speed caused the stern to vibrate so violently that the second cabin accommodations were unlivable. The combined interference of the wakes of the inner and outer propellers caused the violent shaking. At high speeds, the vibration resonated with the ship's structure, exacerbating the problem. The second cabin section had to be gutted and stiffened with additional supports, disguised in the decor as pillars and arches. The additional support improved the comfort of the second cabin accommodations, but never fully solved Lusitania's vibration problem, which would remain throughout her career.
Historically, one cannot speak of the Lusitania without talking of the Titanic. And I see no reason why I should at least break from tradition. But I will point out that there was in fact 3 Olympic-class ships, not just one. And the first 2 were equally as grand, with the Olympic giving good service up until 1935, when it was broken down for scrap, and surviving World War I practically unscathed. The story of the Titanic we all know. It was racing through a field of ice, struck an iceberg and sunk. And looking at the numbers, there's no way it was going to get its hands on that blue ribbon. It just wasn't fast enough. There's much debate as to whether or not that's what it was trying to do. We'll never know the truth on that. But the final ship in the series was to be the Gigantic, but because of the disaster got renamed the Britannic. Was redesigned in a very major way, giving it a second hull and increasing the height of the watertight doors and adding additional lifeboats. However, this vessel never saw passenger service. In World War I, it was fitted out as a hospital ship and sadly struck a mine and sunk very quickly. I have heard that the reason that it sunk so quickly, and possibly even the reason it sunk at all, was that the aft windows were open, and as the ship started to list while taking on water come into the windows, but that is speculation. So let's do an in-depth comparison between the Lusitania and Titanic, as historically we must. It was a wet and gloomy evening the night I saw a movie called A Night to Remember, and since then I have had a lifelong obsession with the Titanic, as have many others. But as time goes on, you look and you see different things, and you start to separate legend from fact. The Titanic was the biggest ship in the world, as was the Lusitania before the Olympics construction. But the difference in length was a mere 30 metres in favour of the Titanic, with the Lusitania having a length of 239.8 metres and the Titanic having a length of 269 metres. In the beam too, there wasn't a great difference, only 1.3 metres, with the Lusitania having a beam of 26.7 metres and the Titanic having a beam of 28. Draft is an interesting subject. The greater the draft, the greater the stability, but the more difficulties one has when going to port. The Titanic, as a bigger ship, had a deeper draft, but the difference between the two ships was only 0.3 of a metre, with the Lusitania having a draft of 10.2 metres and the Titanic having a draft of 10.5 metres. Where the money is passengers, and Lusitania's passenger carrying capacity after the refit was 2,298 souls, whereby the Titanic was capable of carrying 2,453 souls, a difference of 155 passengers. When we start talking in terms of funnels, we reach an interesting conundrum. The makers of Titanic were horrified at the fact that it was only going to have 3 funnels when its competition had 4. So it had a dummy funnel. In the case of the Lusitania, all 4 funnels were working ones. Both vessels had the same number of masts, and by the end of the Lusitania's service it had a similar, or in fact better, radio than the Titanic, which was famous for sending out the first SOS signal. The number of decks was 10 in both cases, but when we come to ship's performance, that is the real difference. The Titanic had a relatively slow, well, not actually, it was quick, service speed of 21 knots. Lusitania had a service speed of 25 knots. That is a difference of 4 knots. And when we get to maximum speed, the Lusitania eclipsed the Titanic in absolute terms of 26.35 knots, with the Titanic having only 23 knots. A difference of 3.3 knots. Coal consumption too favoured the Lusitania. It only burnt 840 tonnes of coal a day, which is quite a lot of pollution when you think about it, but the Titanic required 850 tonnes a day, and indeed had smaller coal bunkers at 6,611 tonnes as opposed to the Lusitania's 7,000 tonne coal bunkers, a difference of a little under 300. The endurance of either ships was interesting. In terms of days, the Lusitania could travel for 8 days at service speed continuously, where the Titanic could only travel for 7.7 days. Not a great difference, but the difference in terms of distance at service speed was 881 nautical miles. And if one was to slow down, then the distance for both ships would increase dramatically. And it is also interesting to note that most of the performance figures for the Titanic in fact come from the Olympic. As everyone knows, the Titanic sunk on its maiden voyage, and its true performance was never really known. In a sea of chaos, it is surprising the calm that can exist. World War I raged in Europe, but destiny never reveals her plans. At the Kennard Pier in New York, known as Pier 54, on the 1st of May 1915 at 12:20, the Lusitania prepared to sail. The Lusitania left port under the command of Captain William Thomas Turner, an experienced seaman and a colourful character, who referred to his passengers as a load of bloody chattering monkeys who never shut up. His gruff manner is even apparent in his photo. As I said earlier in the video, fate is a funny business. William first set foot on a sailing vessel going out to sea as a young boy aged between 8 and 13. The records are somewhat unclear. The vessel Gasme sunk off the coast of Ireland and he was forced to swim ashore, ironically just like the Lusitania. After the Lusitania, he was given captaincy over another Cunard vessel, the SS Averna, which was chartered by the British government to transport troops for World War I, and it too was torpedoed, and again he survived. journey between New York and Liverpool was to be Lusitania's 202nd and was going to be over in about 4 days. Lusitania was believed to be too fast to be torpedoed. Nonetheless, orders were given to plot a zigzag course, something that wasn't always followed. The boilers were stoked and all was made ready. People boarded the mighty ship. The engine telegraph was put to dead slow, and gracefully the vessel moved away from the dock, with waiting tugboats swinging around in New York Harbour. Then she made her way off to sea, while people enjoyed walking around the decks and the fine restaurants on board the ship. Pleasant and peaceful journey was broken on the 7th of May 1915 at 2:10 in the afternoon. Coordinates 51 degrees 25 minutes north, 8 degrees 33 minutes west. The snake in the grass, the U-20, was waiting in ambush to attack an innocent, unarmed, peaceful passenger liner. Some have said the passenger liner should have zigzagged and did not. However, only history knows the true answer. Captain Schweder was the commander of the U-boat and gave the order to fire on an innocent passenger liner. It is said that there was some discourse aboard his vessel when he told them to fire, but fire nonetheless they did, and I shall give him no further credits. U-boat 20's crew spotted the Lusitania. The vessel was identified, but the shot was difficult. They had to shoot ahead of the vessel, as the vessel was travelling almost faster than the torpedoes. Their aim was accurate and deadly, hitting the Lusitania midships, and then the chaos began. The captain realised that he had a problem and realised that the ship was sinking. The ship's speed was north of 20 knots, way too fast to deploy lifeboats. The reversing engines were deployed. Even at the point when lifeboats were deployed, the vessel was still doing 6 knots. The cowardice Germans watched through the luxury of their periscope as the poor people drowned and suffered. Behold a photo of the Lusitania today, located off the coast of Ireland under 93 metres of water in a strangely lifeless part of the ocean. When she set sail, she had 1,964 souls on board, of which 1,195 perished needlessly. Politically speaking, the 123 Americans were the most important. It seems the nationality of those who suffer a disaster seems to worsen the disaster. May the angel Gabriel care for the souls of all that are lost. I will share with you a cartoon from the era regarding the captain of U-boat 20.